Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar Impacts of the Green New Deals on Latin America. We're really happy that you guys are here participating with us today. This conversation is going to be carried out in both English and Spanish with a simultaneous interpretation in both languages. And if you would like to listen to the interpretation, you can click on the little globe, which is in the lower part of your screen that says interpretation. And there you can choose whichever language it is you want to listen in. And you can also silence the original audio if you wish to do so.
Supposed to have in other parts of the world, especially on indigenous territories and in the global south. This, in particular, as a result of the green capitalist approach being taken and the ways in which they will stimulate greater dispossession, land grabbing, and the extraction of a plethora of minerals and metals to build millions of electric vehicles and renewable energy infrastructure. We'll hear from colleagues in the US, Europe, and Latin America about some of these blind spots in thinking through the energy transition in the global north and the way in which the energy transition is being interpreted and implemented in Latin America and some of the proposals coming from the global south. I'd like to pass things over now to my co-moderator for this event, Miriam Lang, professor in the area of environment and sustainability at the Simón Bolívar Andean University in Quito, Ecuador, and part of the Southern Ecosocial Pact. Miriam?
Muchas gracias, Jen. Thanks a lot, Jen.
Thank you so much, Jen. So good afternoon to everyone. I would like to give you a warm welcome to the Southern Ecosocial Pact. And we're really happy that you're here in the second event, which is a series of events that we are co-organizing with the Institute for Policy Studies of Washington and a logic of international dialogue, in this case, a North-South dialogue. For those of you who are not familiarized with the Ecosocial Pact of the South, this is an initiative that began in June of 2020 during the first months of the pandemic, and it was made up of a group of people and organizations from different Latin American countries. It all started with a declaration that you can see on the website if you go to pactoecosocialdelsur.com. So we were motivated at that time by the urgency of creating social dynamics that are able to respond to and counteract the dynamics of capitalist reaccommodation, concentration of wealth, and destruction of ecosystems that we saw coming about during the pandemic and reinforcing themselves during the pandemic. The Ecosocial Pact of the South is an invitation, a broad invitation to everybody who wants to be a part of this to put together a collective horizon of transformation for our America that guarantees a dignified future for everyone. So the pact brings together many different proposals that have been worked on by different social movements in Latin America over the last few decades to put together certain horizons to see where we can go so that Latin American society can move forward to be able to materialize social justice hand in hand with environmental justice, inter-ethnical justice or intercultural justice, but also gender justice. And of course, intergenerational justice and all other dimensions of justice. So it's in this context that I would very much like to invite you to listen to the recording that we have of the first forum that we had on this series, which was about a just transition for Latin America. And this happened back in January. This debate also talked about the validity of an initiative of like the Ecosocial Pact of the South in the current context of Latin America, that of course is not the same as it was back in the beginning, in the mid 2020. We also at the time talked about the different alternatives that are already ongoing on the subcontinent, and this includes a transformation of the energy system and the food system that are all connected to perspectives for a just future that's dignified and sustainable. You can find those videos in Spanish on the Ecosocial Pact of the South Facebook page, and also in English on the Facebook page of the Institute for Policy Studies. While in January, we've been focusing on perspectives of change from and for Latin America. Today, we invite them for a North-South dialogue. So what we want to do here is look at proposals for ecosocial transformation that have been put together from the global North. We want to look further into the possible impacts and effects that these proposals could have on southern regions like Latin America from a perspective of global justice that's oftentimes completely forgotten. So what kind of roles are going to come through these different proposals for a region like that is Latin America? So now, before we go a little bit further into the issue here, I want to repeat for people who have just recently joined that if you would like to listen to the interpretation, you can use the translation button, which is part of your screen on the right, and you can choose whatever language it is that you would like to be listening to the event in.
The room later that if you want to have English translation, you can choose that language in the translation button at the bottom of your screen on the right.
So climate change is something that's just harder to avoid, more visible and more palpable. We've got droughts, we've got floods of historic intensities. We've got giant forest fires that are more and more frequent throughout the world. And to avoid global warming surpassing the thresholds that have been indicated by science as being like safe for human societies, right now, and over the last couple of years, the three largest world powers, which is the United States, the European Union, and China, have committed to each one to reconfigure their economies based on renewable energies. Now, at the same time, climate change is only one of the most visible manifestations of a multidimensional crisis. For example, we're also facing levels of inequality and a concentration of wealth that is unprecedented in the history of the world. And this is why the hegemonic projects of decarbonization by governments in the United States and in Europe have been, over these past, these are the ones that we're going to focus on today, have been disputed when we talk about the leftists. And we have generated a series of alternative proposals that are called Green New Deals. This name refers to the historic New Deal that was promoted by Franklin D. Roosevelt. This was a dynamization of the U.S. economy from the government, where to react to the Great Depression of 1929. It was focused really on creating jobs from the public sector, from within the public sector, and similarly, and sort of like resonating with this same previous period. Now what Green New Deals are looking is to combine decarbonization of economies with justice, social justice. And so I'm going back to Jen now.
Who are going to be speaking from this perspective during our conversation. Ulrich Brand works as professor of international politics at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna, Austria. His research topics are critical social theory, social ecological transformations, and imperial mode of living. Last year, his book on the imperial mode of living, published with Marcus Wyssen, was published in English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. He's a member of the Alternatives to Development Working Group and currently has a one-year research fellowship at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin. Rajiv Sikora is Senior Policy Advisor for US Congressman Jamal Bowman, representing New York's 16th District, and led the office's work on Representative Bowman's Green New Deal for public schools legislation. Previously, Rajiv worked as the primary researcher on Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, and later at The Leap, an organization that advanced intersectional solutions to the overlapping crises of climate change, racism, and inequality. Miriam?
Hay una larga historia, como muchos aquí presentes sabemos.
There's a long story that many of us know about unequal exchange between Latin America and the different regions of the North. Also today, Latin America at a global level is the region of the world that has the largest net exports of materials per inhabitant. So since the decade of the 1970s, the extraction of such materials has, based on recent scientific work, has multiplied by 4 in Latin America. This is growth that is much above the global average. The extractive level that we've seen recently is just unprecedented. And it's possible that only in the last 4 decades from Latin America, we've extracted more material for export than in the entire previous history of the region. At the same time, the majority of Latin American economies import at a higher price than they actually export. So to say this another way, they are decapitalizing in material terms without this generating positive economic return. This reconfirms the idea of ecologically exchange and unequal ecological and economical exchange. So on this basis, there are some people who say that the veins of Latin America continue to be open, alluding to the famous text that was written by Eduardo Galeano. So fighting against this global injustice, there are many different demands for environmental justice and climate justice. It's a clamor to recognize the historic debt that Europe and the United States have with the regions of the South and for their reparations. Environmental justice is also one of the pillars of the Ecosocial Pact of the South. Now, in the scenario of the current policies of decarbonization that constitute, as we said, a reaction to climate change, the perspective of global justice becomes key. This means we can ask ourselves, what kind of effects will the reforms on the economies of the North in the United States and Europe that are pointing at these, net zero emissions, what kind of effect are these going to have on regions like Latin America? So effectively, we're seeing a large increase in a demand for raw materials. The World Bank is talking about a 500% increase in the demand, in the global demand for lithium between 2018 and 2050, with rates that are going to be similar for graphite and also for cobalt. And according to different sources of information, Latin America holds somewhere between 53 and 83% of the world reserves of lithium. So specifically, when we're talking about Bolivia here. Regardless, this is a large portion of the world's reserves are found in this subregion. 40% of the world's reserves of copper, which is also a very precious metal, for example, to build electrical cars. At the same time, and according to the WWF, Latin America is the region of the world that has more biodiversity has been lost ever since the 1970s. So the big question here is, are we seeing what's going to be happening as a new wave of extractivism that's coming? Jen, go ahead. So on this, we are going to hear from 2 speakers, Esperanza Martinez, who's an Ecuadorian. She's a biologist and she is a lawyer. She's the co-founder of the organization Acción Ecológica, where she's been working for the last 30 years. She's also part of the Ecosocial Pact of the South. Enrique Viale is an environmentalist lawyer from Argentina, and he works with citizen struggles to defend water and territories against agrobusiness, mega mining, fracking, and offshore. He really is one of the people that has been a key part of the Ecosocial Pact of the South from the very beginning. His most recent book is called El Colapso Ecológico Ya Llegó, which was written alongside Maristela Swampa.
We're going to get started with our conversation now. And the first question goes to Rajiv. Rajiv, you advise Congressman Jamal Bowman, who's promoting the Green New Deal as a public policy alternative in the US. What is being discussed in the US right now under President Biden's administration in terms of climate policies? And to what extent does the Green New Deal proposal differ from the government's program? What are the main disputes and what are the chances that the Green New Deal will?
Great question. Thank you. And first of all, just, thanks for having me. I've been, very inspired by the work of my fellow panelists here and also the organizers of this event for many years now. So it's an honor to be part of this conversation. In terms of what the Biden administration is doing, I can try to, it's hard to be optimistic right now at this moment in time, but I can try to start with the positive and positive-ish elements of this. There are some ways that the Green New Deal movement has kind of made a positive impact on the conditions of possibility right now in the US. The administration has, set some ambitious goals. They're not necessarily, well, they're definitely not in line with what really the US fair share would be of global emissions reduction, and they don't deal with our obligations to the South, but we're trying to get to a fully renewable electricity system by 2035. Which is going to be difficult, and it's going to be a big effort. They use the language of urgency and crisis and the need to really transform our economy in a fundamental way that's going to create, really improve the lives of everyday people materially and create millions of good unionized jobs. And they recognize that in order to do this, we have to sort of mobilize a holistic government response over the next decade. And so sort of those ideas are all really key to the Green New Deal vision. They've also, I think, had what I would say is a genuine emphasis on environmental justice, at least as sort of conceived within the borders of the US. And we'll come back to that problem there. But, they set a goal of directing 40% of the benefits, at least, of climate investment into historically marginalized communities, those who have been, those that have borne the brunt of the fossil fuel economy, the impacts of extraction and combustion of fossil fuels and other harms and injustices of our economy. And that demand, didn't come directly from the Green New Deal, but the Green New Deal certainly adopted and helped synthesize sort of decades of work and organizing and demands from the environmental justice movement led by Black and Brown and Indigenous movements in the US, and sort of helped play a role in crystallizing that for the Biden administration. So one way you can see a direct influence is that the Biden administration has, really embraced this idea of a civilian climate corps modeled directly off a New Deal era program, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put, unemployed young men or young men who needed work during the Depression, put them to work building, parks and doing ecological restoration projects, planting trees. So AOC, Congressman Ocasio-Cortez, really has played a central role in defining what that proposal would look like should it be implemented. So in terms of the differences, and there are many, one of the obvious ones has to do with scale. So when Bernie Sanders ran for president in 2020, he put out a really detailed and visionary Green New Deal platform that called for investing $16 trillion over the next 10 years. And President Biden, in contrast, started out his presidency with a $2 trillion proposal. And that has sort of, that was part of his signature legislation that he's been trying to pass in the US, which is called Build Back Better, as in, build back better from the pandemic. And this is, unfortunately, we've been trying to pass that bill for over a year now. It's very pathetic that we haven't been able to do it yet. And that's sort of what congressional, climate staffers like myself have been really obsessing over the past years, how to get this passed. It's been steadily attacked by a small number of corporate-backed Democrats in the same governing party, to be clear, who have really held this up and slashed it down. And they just sort of didn't have the leadership of the party has not had a real strategy to mobilize people at a grassroots level to push for this, which is important to note that is really at the heart of the Green New Deal vision as well. How we, not just what we're pushing, but how we get there politically and strategically. So anyway, the Biden administration Build Back Better climate spending has really, been whittled down to something like 550 billion that we hopefully will pass. There's been a lot of attention, as I just sort of outlined, to the scale, and that's important, but I would say there has not been enough on the sort of quality of investments, and that's another big difference here. The Biden administration's not really thinking about what the public sector can do. Imaginatively, they've done some stuff on government procurement of various green technologies, and that's important, but they haven't done enough of that. But just looking at the effort to scale up and deploy wind and solar, for example, Build Back Better is mostly the biggest chunk is tax credits for private capitalist development, whereas the Green New Deal is saying we should really have the public sector driving this transition. And the argument there is that, of course, we can sort of develop the clearest and we can do it faster. We can develop the economic planning capacity to also phase down fossil fuels at the same time as we're scaling up renewables. And sorry about that. So the Biden administration is not doing a good job at phasing down fossil fuels. So if we had the public sector driving this, we would be able to do it faster. We'd be able to do industrial planning better. We'd be able to guarantee the highest possible labor standards, community input standards, make sure we're directing those investments to marginalized communities, and really guaranteing cheap renewable electricity to people as a human right. So as you can hear from my alarm that went off there, I'm a bit over time, but I'll just try to close briefly by saying this demand for publicly owned renewable energy, you're going to see a lot more of that from the US, and that has really had a lot of traction at the state level in New York. But the Green New Deal bills that have been introduced so far have really focused on public infrastructure and this nexus of the public sector guaranteeing fundamental rights that people rely on to meet their fundamental needs, and environmental justice. So there was the resolution that AOC introduced that laid out the vision, the overall principles of this. And there have been 3 bills. One of them, as the moderator mentioned, that I worked on is the Green New Deal for public schools. So that's getting every public school in the country to 0 carbon emissions, investing in education at the same time, because these institutions have been completely neglected. They're falling apart. There's all sorts of health harms that are, as well as climate disasters that are impacting students, particularly in Black and Brown communities. There's also the Green New Deal for public housing, same idea there with respect to the public housing system, and Green New Deal for cities that was introduced by Cori Bush, Representative Cori Bush. The Green New Deal for public housing was represented by AOC. So I think the last thing I'll just say is you can see that there's also this theme of the care economy and shifting our economy to principles of care. Education is a low carbon sector, just as much as wind and solar. And you can also get a glimpse there of the kind of organizing strategy that we're dealing with here. We're also talking about, hey, what are the coalitions we need to get together to win this kind of radical change in the US? Teachers pushing for this alongside workers who would benefit from the work of retrofitting public school facilities and installing wind and solar, together with young people who are pushing a radical vision of climate action, and just community members. Schools are, for example, kind of, as Congressman Bowman says, the heartbeat of our communities. It's hard to imagine an institution that touches the lives of more people than schools. So that's kind of an overview of some of the content that we've been pushing legislatively. These bills are not necessarily going to pass soon, but we're using them to influence vehicles like Build Back Better to get money for public housing and schools in those packages, and also steadily building support. But we have a lot of work to do that it's exciting work to be involved in, even though it's very hard.
Great, Rajiv. Thank you so much for giving us insight into what is going on in the US. Uli, you have closely followed the debates in Europe. The European Union is presenting its official decarbonization program called the Green Deal, without the new in the middle, at the end of 2019. What are its main ingredients? And also in the European case, in which main points do the Green New Deal proposals from the left differ from this official program?
Yes, hello everybody, also from my side. Hola a todos. It's almost midnight in Europe, but I'm very happy that we have this conversation and dialogue. I will be very brief. I will talk for a moment on the European Green Deal, as Miriam introduced, and then on some progressive leftist proposals for Green New Deals, which are much more diverse. The European Green Deal was presented end of 2019, before the pandemic started, by the new president of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. I see it in a continuity with the green economy proposals that were formulated after the financial and economic crisis in 2008, 2009. And the European Green Deal is very explicit to be a growth strategy, to transform the European Union into a just and wealthy society with modern, resource efficient and as a competitive economy. So it's a growth strategy, and it's a strategy to gain global competitiveness. I think this is very important when we afterwards talk about relationships with the global south. There should be, Raj already talked about the US, large investment, 260 billion trillion, I have to translate rightly, euro until 2030 for public investment into a circular economy, a massive growth of renewable energy, sustainable construction, mobility, agriculture, very parallel to what Raj was presenting. My interpretation of the European Green Deal with many other critical scholars is that it's a half transformation. It's an attempt to transform the energy basis, not the resource basis, the energy basis of the economy, but not its political economy. It's still the idea that with markets, with private investment, with capitalist growth imperatives, which should be green, we will overcome the climate crisis and that we can decarbonize. It's if we go to the example of the mobility sector, it's not about reconstructing the mobility system. It's mainly to have electrification of the car fleet. So there is the plan to have until 2030 a certain amount of electric cars, and this is not the main. It's not the kind of the requirement to really change the mobility system. When it comes to international relations, to the preconditions, to the resource attraction and required for this transformation, it's a blind spot. Yeah, it's almost absent in the official strategies. So to finish this first part, with Antonio Gramsci, a critical philosopher from Italy, I would call the European Green Deal a passive revolution. It's really an attempt of the elites to change the resource base, on largely the energy basis of the economy, without changing power structure, without changing dominant logics of capitalist growth and accumulation imperatives. When it comes to the progressive Green New Deals, a much more diverse debate, of course, they are also linked to decarbonization. This is a consent with the European Green Deal, but I would say that there are four aspects which are kind of different from the European Green Deal. Raj already also presented some in his intervention. The first is that while the European Green Deal argues the state is important, but the state should give incentives to private capital to invest and to kind of accompany a bit the greening of the economy. In the progressive radical Green New Deals, the state has a central role, which is quite different. Public housing, public services, which is for continental Europe not so radical, because we have in Austria and Germany a public educational system, public health system, but that the state should play a major role in this reconstruction of the economy. Second, as already Raj said, while the European Green Deal says nobody and no one should be left behind, it's a very paternalistic understanding. What will happen with the people? The Green New Deals, the progressive Green New Deals, insist on a just transition, which means that the workers really should have good jobs, that green jobs should be created. And in conversion processes of certain industries, the workers in these industries should get good jobs, secure good jobs. A third aspect, there is some divergence, but I would say it's also a cornerstone of the progressive Green New Deals, is it's not only the electrification of the economy, it's also a reduction, it's a shrinking, it's a building back of certain branches of the automotive sector, of the air transport sector, chemical sector, industrial agriculture, and others. So a shrinking of the economy, but to organize it in a just way is also a cornerstone of the Green New Deal proposals. And the last aspect, and Raj already also mentioned it, is to rethink what is well-being about. Well-being about is not so much status consumption, to have a larger car, to have the possibility to fly across Europe or worldwide, but the care economy, the idea that we need to care for ourselves, for others, for the community, for the society, for nature, which is so present now in the corona pandemic, is also a cornerstone of many Green New Deal proposals. There are some differences. I just mentioned them, and then I will finish within my 5-6 minutes. There is a shrinking of the economy, a shrinking of certain branches is, I would say, a consent. But if it's a degrowth strategy, if we should get rid of the degrowth, of the growth imperative of the capitalist economy, is a bit contested within the Green New Deal debate. And the last point I would like to make is that most, and this is a challenge for us if we have a global dialogue, most Green New Deal proposals are at the end state reformist. They think that the state can make a difference, but there is very little reflection that the state is part of the problem, that the state is patriarchal, capitalist, imperial, and that we need to rethink the very structures, the very functions of the state. And I just went in the last 2-3 months through all the literature on Green New Deals, and I was really surprised and impressed that there is almost no reflection on the very state. There is a lot of statement the state should do, and the state should have an important role in the transformation process. But what the state means and how the state structure should be changed, this is also a blind spot. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julie. And just an invitation to all who are listening to put your questions in the chat or in the question and answer box, and we'll be collecting those for a round of questions at the end of the discussion. Una invitación a todos mientras están escuchando.
So while you're listening, if you would like to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we're going to have some opportunities to do some Q&A at the end of this conversation. So now, Esperanzo, so reflecting from Latin America, what comments do you are provoked in you of these different proposals and discussions that are mentioned from the United States and Europe? So do you think that these answers are adequate when we talk about the current multidimensional crisis the world is going through? I'm so happy to be here with people who are looking for justice. I want to give some ideas about the different transitions and how those are related. So when I think from the South, like how are they justified? When I think about the different scenarios in which, you know, they take out a lot of the negative parts of these ideas. And so I was thinking that the need to eliminate the oil and gas model. And I remember from the South when we talked about the fact that we wanted to get away from oil production, and they said that it was impossible because it was so unpopular in the North. And it's only so much longer in the future. We saw that the problem was that it was costing lives, more lives, obviously, in the South because of the wars, because of cancer, and because of all the things that were lacking. But that this historic marginalization that we've seen. But now when we look at climate change agendas, we've seen that we're only looking at carbon. And so we've had to like take a long long, a long path way back to say that those problems, those to solve those climate problems, we have to close up these oil wells. And it's not just, talking about carbon, that we've seen that it's a whole total different like land dispossession. I mean, Ecuador here is an oil and gas country, and so Ecuador is here at all levels. Ecuador is an oil and gas country that is pushing forward clean energy with large hydroelectric plants that cause like major disasters around the world. And now we are the largest exporter of balsa wood for wind energy because it's something that is needed. And so you need to use balsa wood. So I was going to show you some images about what balsa wood is doing in our territories, because it's really difficult when we talk about oil and gas, and you can think about like an oil spill, you can think about like a fire, and you can easily imagine like just how negative that is in our territory. But when we talk about something like balsa wood, you could even think that it's green and it's something that could be used for forest recovery projects. But no, I mean, these balsa wood extraction processes are really affecting negatively indigenous communities. So let's remember that balsa has traditional uses, and those are now being there's now the wild balsa wood is no longer available, and we're even talking about this happening in protected areas, like for example the Yasuni, which was a place where they were going to leave the oil underground, etc. But anyway, so now we are going into these territories where we have voluntarily isolated populations are living. So this is where you have wild balsa, and it also affects the Andes. And there we can start to see, landslides that come from removing this balsa wood. It also is effects in Esmeraldas, where we have many different ways of land dispossession, where we have Afro-Ecuadorians throughout the coast. So in all these different scenarios, we have to think that all of this works with this idea of exports and et cetera. It's a really complex issue. And this is the part where I would really like for us to really look into these transitions. So first of all, from the South. So why do we have this happens with this idea of having a proposal that generates all these kind of disasters that, at some point are going to, I'm going to show you some pictures of what's going on. So let's imagine that this balsa wood boom is happening, and through the COVID. And so this is because people didn't have any income, especially people who are working in services or in tourism. And so if we put this alongside the state's decision, we saw people that were left with no money. And so this is where we had this opportunity of balsa wood. And so this becomes like a really great business, because these are people in the countryside who give their land and the seeds and everything, and they get their payment 3 or 4 years later, which sounds like a really good deal. But the problem is that these are managed, the exports are managed by the company. Prices went down. There's too much production of balsa wood. That's what happened in 2020, and so this affected all of these peasants who had changed their way of managing their land. And so Ecuador was always a major balsa exporter, but over the last couple of years and over time, we've seen that the prices went down. I'm talking about this happened over the course of a year. It wasn't like a 20-year thing. It was a process that just happened violently because we weren't taking into account what are the different, the logic behind the life and work in a country like Ecuador, where work is, happens in the countryside. These are peasants. There's different processes that go faster and others that go slower. So anyway, this idea of transition, which I've always talked about, because it's always seemed to me that in the logic is to look for transitions that allow us to abandon these models that affect people, villages, territories, that affect rights. We're situating here in what for us becomes a system of criminality, because it happens so fast when we talk about the different actions that are taken. And for you guys to understand what's the logic behind this is that when these different businesses come in a violent way, and you've got this, they make people go away from their traditional activities. So this leads to a whole bunch of disorder throughout all of these different communities, where you've got robberies, violence, and you've got this whole balsa market goes into areas where before there were certain restrictions. So for example, when it came to wild wood, because we were able to establish certain restrictions on certain species that are called fine wood. It sounds kind of stupid. I mean, they're really, just these are threatened wood species, but they call them fine wood. That's what they call it in these disputed territories. And so what this is causing in this model is a change of land use. And so this change of land use is really key when we talk about extractivism coming in. And so it's not that it's a transition of extractivism, but rather it's the way that extractivism comes into the territory, because a land where you've cut down all the forests is a place where now you don't have arguments when we talk about rights that, biodiversity or that, food sovereignty. This is land where now mining companies can come in because you've lost that whole possibility of having protection. And so these are part of a long-standing struggles that we've had in here in the South, but these are a part of many of the struggles that we've had for rights and for justice. And so we have to take into account that all this is happening in a place where we have a country that recognizes the rights of nature, okay? And so when it comes to, balsa wood, where this comes in, so these are the paths where how extractivism comes in, where mining comes in a really violent way, because now we've seen that this modality of the mining, where they do illegal mining. And so let's move people so that they can go in and destroy the territories. And then after that, give the solution as being like transnational mining, because the transnational mining is something that can put in an agenda. So here we're talking about climate change from the transition, and the response is mining, destruction, and above all, disasters. And so the images that I'm going to be showing you here, you're going to see the different disasters, because here you have a really interesting issue, which is that this entire issue of transitions is something that's being managed based on avoiding disasters, quote unquote, natural disasters. But here in the South, we see that they have absolutely nothing to do with natural disasters. These are man-made disasters. These are man-made disasters that have been made now. And so we could make a roadmap and see how from here in into a year from now, you're going to see disasters that are going to come about because that are going to have really major effects. And so just to close out here over these just a few minutes that I have, that the big problem that we have here with this type of modalities and economic intervention is that we lose autonomy. And so what we need to win for these through these transitions is autonomy. And so what we're living here is that we're seeing that we're exporting problems from the north. And what we do is that we're eventually importing this problem with autonomy. And so what happens is something that's really perverse, because we don't resolve the problems. I mean, the real problems, because we continue just avoiding the problems because it's not a technological issue. It's the problem is consumption, but the cost is to sacrifice autonomy. And those are the things that can let us to talk about transitions that we don't have to really like invent, some of them. I'm sorry that I have to interrupt, but for this to become a dialogue, I think it's really important that we need to be a little bit more dynamic. I'm done. Great. And thank you so much for really showing us here how to say, telling us what's really happening in countries like Ecuador, despite the fact that that entire transition to a large green capitalism is still just getting started. And so I think that there's a lot of things that we've got to talk about here. So Enrique, so Argentina is one of the countries that's right now really in view, because it has a lot of lithium reserves. And this metal is so important for storing energy in this energy transition scenario. So for example, for electrical car batteries. Then they want to, make hundreds of thousands of these cars everywhere. So what I want to ask you is, how are these issues being discussed in Argentina, and what are the different positions that have been taken on in a country that, again, has a progressive government, which is that of Fernandez? So is this seen as an opportunity, as a threat? Who sees it that way? And what kind of impacts are we seeing already? Enrique, you are on mute. Hello. Good afternoon, or good evening to some others. and very late night for Uri. I'm really happy to have so many friends here and so many people that are learning about all this, all the people that have been working with us on these struggles. And so, you know, so before answering this question, I wanted to talk about a few things that are related to the previous question from Esperanza, which is key because it is a really fundamental part of this North-South debate. So the Ecosocial Pact of the South, or what we've called that way, this has come out of the South and it's for the South to not continue to just have thinking that comes from the North. And so I think that that's really important. Why is that important? Because when we talk about proposals, when we talk about transition, you don't put in the central, the idea of ecological death between the North and the South, nor does it go beyond a proposal that in many that oftentimes has to do a lot of decarbonization. The problems in Latin America are totally different from those we have in the North. And that's important and it's key and it's important to talk about that. And it's, we've got this, major asymmetry historical, the ecological debt that we have is just so large. So now going into answering your question, Miriam, so in the name of the energy transition, everything's approved. Or everything happens under this, headline of ecological transition. And so that's really important to keep in mind because this is what's happening to us now in the country. Every ecological transition, we're going to do a new nuclear plant. That's energy transition, gas energy transition, and energy transition of the North. And so it seems that we are going to sacrifice our territories yet again. But now, in the name, before it was in the name of development, but now it's in the name of energy transition. So, which is a concept that is really in dispute. And what we really need to do is dispute it, and that the Ecosocial Pact really wants to dispute. Because the energy transition is something that that's the basis of this concept, because we don't want to just, we don't want a transition to, so what we want, again, we're just promoting a corporate model and not a grassroots change. I mean, here what we need to see, and this is important for us to have this dialogue between the North and the South, just to be what is understood by a transition, and that we aren't going to be the ones that, again, are going to end up sacrificing our territories so that everybody in the United States can have the Tesla car, right? So that this new idea should be, like Uri says, that it should. So I went blank here because it's because of my COVID has kind of given me some brain fog. Anyway, okay, so to that effect, I think it's really important, this idea. And so within this, it appears that we're having like a major deja vu, like from what Miriam's saying. And so now the new idea is this triangle of lithium that we've got in the northern part of Argentina, also shared with Chile and with Bolivia, and that this is the new gold, right? This is the new Dorado, where we can, we can get a lot of wealth, but where what made all the, the conquistadores that came to really gain power. And so that continues happening, So Esperanza can tell us, like, what is the Dorado of Ecuador? It happens everywhere, And so in Colombia, you've got something else with mining, etc. And so for our case, before it was, before it was something else, now it's lithium, and that's what's going to save us, right? So everything is always justified in the name of lithium. And so it's within that framework that we have this coincidence that the place where the lithium is located, there are indigenous people who have been living there for a long, long time, and that they are being absolutely, all their rights are being violated. And so I insist on the altar of this idea of, ecological transition or energy transition. And so in 1969, the ILO issued some legislation. So in a really, lithium is in a very desert area where you've got 2 million liters of water, which is needed to produce any of this lithium. And so this is a total imbalance when it comes to the ecosystems. So for example, Leven, which is a really well-known company, which in 15 days uses as much water as everybody in the whole town of Antofagasta uses in 1 year. So, to make it worse, in our country is so liberalized. So, you've got Bolivia that's got a certain legislation, Argentina, everything's liberal, where we've got, the mining that came in the 90s in the Washington Consensus. And so everything's been written, with the same pencil, where they put a limit on royalties and on certain things with taxes, and they don't even allow, there's a prohibition for the state to even participate in the production. I mean, our legislation is something that not even in the previous progressive administration, nor now, I even dare to change that. And so I think that the real challenge comes in there, because we are living with a certain type of neo extractivism. And so now we're, instead of the commodities boom, which is what we saw in the previous period, now it's in the name of energy transition, and we have got to dispute it. And so that's, I would say much more, but I don't want Miriam to get mad at me.
Gracias, Enrique.
Okay, thank you, Enrique.
I want to circle back to you and ask, to what extent is the huge amount of raw materials that both Esperanza and Enrique have commented on that are needed for the proposed energy transition and the destructive impacts of their extraction being discussed amongst the lefts and social movements in the US right now?
Yeah, so great question. From a movement sort of organizing perspective, I think we've come a long way. I sort of remember, just a few years ago, feeling like, hearing, really learning about really good work being done on this from groups that were more likely to be Canada or UK based in terms of the, Anglophone conversation about this stuff. But I think we've made a lot of progress. It is something that climate justice and environmental justice organizers are talking about a lot right now. And there are US-based groups that are taking part in growing sort of global coalitions. And I think part of that is may have something to do with the fact that there is this, there are calls for increased lithium extraction, for example, in California and Nevada in the US, where you have the same problem of trampling over the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. So there's been resistance there. And so that link is being made, I think. The bottom line, of course, is that, we can't just shift sacrifice zones around. We have to eliminate them altogether. And we need to have, global cooperation on genuinely democratic models of development. So I think we're in a good place where there's been a foundation that we can work with at the movement level. But in terms of the government, it has not, and the conversation in Congress, it's not really being discussed. If you were to sort of talk about supply chain justice and extractivism in certain conversations that I take part in, you sort of get blank stares and confusion. So people are, but I think we're in a good spot to start pushing this, pushing this issue, forcing the issue. What's sort of mildly good about what the Biden administration is doing is that they're, trying to look at how do we do more recycling of minerals and materials used in batteries, for example? How do we pursue an innovation policy that's going to reduce the need for some of this stuff? But we're not, in terms of the mainstream paradigm, we're not focusing on the most important ways to address this from a domestic policy point of view. And that is, as my comrades on the panel have pointed out, it's reducing demand for them in the first place by fundamentally changing how we consume and how our economies are structured, right? So, there was a bill that I've talked about how the Build Back Better bill did not pass. there was another bill that was sort of split off from President Biden's climate proposals that passed in a bipartisan fashion with the Republicans. This was an infrastructure bill, and they're trying to claim that it's a climate friendly bill, but it invests much more in highways and car infrastructure than it does in public transit, which is, insane. And, as Uli was bringing up, there's this whole thread of degrowth thinking in this that, I've certainly been engaged in over the years, and it's hard to talk about. I think one of the windows of opportunity we have with the Green New Deal framework, despite its many blind spots, is this weigh in on care and well-being and shifting what the definition of sort of a good life is. And we're very far behind Latin American movements, of course, but there is this emerging idea that if we can have free time, if we can have access to free arts and public services of many kinds, if we can, we're going to be less likely to consume in a materials intensive way if we have our basic needs met. Not only our basic needs, but everyone has sort of the access to the means of pursuing their creativity and spending time with loved ones, and that sort of, I think that's the direction where we need to go. But unfortunately, and I'll just say quickly, the context for the discussion on materials and minerals is taking part as part of this, competition with China. There's another big bill, and this is a bit complex legislatively, so I'll try not to get bogged down, but there's a big China competition bill that's moving through Congress, and it combines investments in innovation with competing with China. And so that has to do with a lot of green tech related and other tech related measures. It's so the way we're thinking about supply chains here is really just about sort of getting control of them to avoid disruptions to our economy, and whether that's sort of securing access to materials and inputs, or onshoring production to the US where that's possible. But again, then you just run the risk of sort of shifting sacrifice zones around. The overall framework is sort of this zero-sum competition, and the bill, I think there are opportunities for the left to intervene in this and try to shift the narrative again, but it's a bill that is sort of a dangerous mishmash of we're going to invest in a really ambitious way in science and innovation, but we're also going to try to throw money indiscriminately at big microchip companies to get them to come here, and we're going to go into global South countries and literally try to it's this ridiculous idea that we're going to push China out, and we're going to make countries in the global South want to come to us for development assistance and energy related assistance. So in this bill that I'm mentioning, this Innovation in China Competition bill, there's a Senate version of it and there's a House version of it. And the Senate version is worse in this respect, but it really is this militarized approach to competing with China. And so there is money for military support for Latin American countries, and energy related assistance, as I mentioned, to other countries. And so it's this green nationalism framework. We're going to become the dominant ones, and we're going to export our technologies to the rest of the world. So anyway, I think we've laid the movement and intellectual groundwork to make progress on this. There's organizations like the Climate and Community Project that's trying to make the link between this work that's happening with bringing in scholars like Thea Rio-Francos and try to, translate that into policy. And I'm working on a bill related to expanding energy storage technologies that I hope, with, again, this public ownership, can we work in some of these ideas about how to really talk about supply chain justice. And as Uli said, it's not just about public ownership, but transforming the nature of public ownership so that it really is about democratizing this.
Great, Rajiv, thanks. Uli, and how is this in Europe? Do you have this discussion there about what will go on in regions like Latin America if the Green Deal goes on as planned? And I have known that there are certain laws being discussed both at the European and at the member state level about the responsibility of companies all along the global value chains. Is this also an issue for the decarbonization perspective? And also, what is the weight of the degrowth debate in that whole scenario? And are there Green New Deal's proposals that are really concerned about the Global South?
Oh, many questions. Thank you. And I share with the participant from Papua New Guinea that my next day already started. I'm on February 17th. The Supply Chain Acts, which is Miriam, you are referring to, this comes from a UN initiative from, I think, 2011. And it was the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights. And it's mainly to make the final producers responsible when at the supply chain in former production steps, there were human rights violations, child labor and others. And this was now in Germany, for example, that we have a law since 1 year and it's implemented. It starts to become real next year. It also, there are some aspects of environmental standards, social standards along the supply chain. It's not explicitly about decarbonization, but in fact, yeah, if we have other standards, but it's not in the law, in the legal framework. Your second question is, when I listen to Enrique and to Esperanza, and the sheer amount of materials, when Esperanza says in some decades, a few decades, there are fourfold, yeah, this is the explosion of the sheer material which is extracted and exported. This is completely absent from the public. And our challenge would not be, I would say, to now show numbers, but to make out of the numbers a story, a narrative, to give good examples. Maybe this is a challenge for us here or for the Grupo Permanente to really to make it as an experience, not as in a moralizing way, yeah, but to show if you use public transport and not the car, or if you eat not the industrial food all the day, this has an implication for the extraction and export of materials in the Global South. It's completely absent. The other part of your question, Miriam, is, I would say within the Green New Deals, the progressive proposals, of course, there is a lot of mentioning of historic responsibility, colonial legacies. The Green Climate Fund should get more money. There is a redistribution of resources, that there should be no pollution elsewhere. But my point, and this is why our debate is so important, the Green New Deal approaches, I know, from the US, from the UK, from continental Europe, are talking about the Global South, but there's no dialogue with the Global South. There is almost no reflection of the experiences Esperanza and Kike are referring to. It's the South, it's a homogeneous space, which is of course exploited, it's dependent, the living conditions are not good. But the challenge here is really to have a dialogue and an understanding also about the struggles. Of course, there is a reference to the struggles, but there is no, I don't want to say meat now, carne. There is no sense, there is no concrete idea what this means when Esperanza gives us the story with the wood. This is completely absent. So it's a new object, objectifying. The South is an object. It's a poor object which is exploited. And our challenge is really to have this dialogue and to have also stories, and to have stories of exploitation, but also stories of struggle, of success, to make this more visible in the global north.
Thank you so much, Uli. Quiero dar una pregunta un poco reflexionando lo que acabo
Now
de
I
decir.
want to have a question here, reflecting a little bit on what Uli was saying. So Esperanza, maybe based on what Uli was saying, could you tell us a little bit about the fact that what are the different expectations that you have when you talk about the partners that you have in the Global North to really open up that dialogue for that kind of interrelationship that's being proposed from the Ecosocial Pact to the South? So I think that Uli really said it. He hit the nail on the head that we need to have a dialogue, but to have a dialogue, You need to have a dialogue. I mean, it's not just a declaration, but it's like you have to actually start having the dialogue. And so I think that, so when we talk about generalizations, like overgeneralizations, China's going through so many transitions. So we export the balsa, and everything that I talked about has to do with the basis of transition that's going on in China, but it's also Ecuador's oil and gas monopoly. And are we doing this to like abandon the fossil fuels? But basically all of the oil that we export, so where am I going with this? What I'm trying to say is that we import, we export cheap, and we import really expensive for what we need to actually extract the balsa. And so how can the country use these two discourses when we talk about a transition, to say our Ministry of the Environment, now it's called the Ministry of Ecological Transition, but we continue exporting oil. We keep producing oil in protected areas. Now we've got this whole balsa wood issue to get to the Chinese market. So there's no really a dialogue, not even from within or from outside, or a perspective where we can really balance out the different perspectives between the South and the North. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of things that we can do in this dialogue, and once it gets started, that can really give us some help, to see where we could go with this. And I think that there must be, the liability, putting that on the companies. That's important, but the companies have the state is complicit. And they're blackmailed. And so there's not like this independent ability to control these actions by the companies. And so we had a case about climate change with a Chinese company that was operating in the Yasuni. And obviously the case was not accepted because there are investment contracts and there's things that the companies call legal certainty. So only works for investors, and it doesn't work for anything when you're talking about human rights, or in our case, the rights of nature. And so for, with the companies, I think it's really important to have an agenda that really reinforces those obligations, but in an independent ways, not between states, but with ambition from other sectors that can really see what's going on here. So control on investments, I mean, that's really important. So the investments that are made, at least when it comes to the South, is not something that should be done if there is not like a full verification that they're actually, meeting the human rights and nature's rights, so that investment doesn't become blackmail. It can't be that because through investment that then I can get education, because through by exporting these materials, I can have education. So that kind of control needs to be something that's going to be really important. And also, I think that there's like a discussion that we need to have, and that's pending, which is between the North and the South. And somebody did mention it here. I think it was Rajiv, or I can't remember who said it, but it's this issue of the concept of what is public. This public property is, how this is an issue that guarantees the common good, or to what extent is it just public dispossession, and that in which the private sector is also implicit. And so, here I think we can have like a real horizontal conversation about this, but also, when we talk about nature and all these, there's so many different, horizontal discussions that we can have, because people have been dispossessed of this historic bias when it comes to colonization. And so, I think that there's this possibility to have a dialogue between the North and the South is something that's so interesting. And I hope it happens, but I think that for that to actually happen, we have to start. And so, because it's something that's just been discourse and not like a reality. Thank you so much, Esperanza. So Enrique, I would like to invite you to continue with what Esperanza was saying, and give us your reflections on what you think is how can we like reconfigure these relationships between the North and the South, which, as we're seeing, if we don't really act, we're going to see the same kind of patterns happening again, and we're not going to see any sort of transition for anyone in the end. So what are the paths? What are the most important ways from your point of view, or what would also be your expectations when you talk about partners in the global North, about where they need to place their priorities? So I think it's like an issue that's key here. I really like this debate, and I mean, I just think it's so important. I think the important thing is that when we see like debates in the global North, they only talk about decarbonization. It's like that's the only issue is about decarbonization, as if that were even possible, but if that were sufficient. And it's in that framework they forget about all the local impacts that we have of these development models that we have as if it was some sort of, destination, and making our territories into colonies. And so these, new ideas, new narratives, we need to have new narratives now in the name of this energy transition, right? And so it becomes more difficult, especially for the environmentalists. I mean, those, these environmentalists have been, now they're against this energy transition. So for Argentina, just so you have an idea, so the name of the energy transition has just now in deep waters, offshore, they can do deep water drilling for oil in the name of energy transition. And so I say, we have to be watching that, because there's this asymmetry, and it's not just by chance that the countries in the north. I mean, what's going to happen if they meet Biden's promise that by 2030, half of America's cars will be electric? Who's going to be sacrificing their territory to make that happen? And so I think, with this idea of sacrifice, and so the Ecosocial Pact is trying to create dialogue about this, on its own behalf as well. So if you want, we can change the name, but like what we want here in the South is to talk about the transition here, because there's a lot of different things here. There's a lot of different transitions that are happening. There's several, one that's just, another one that's grassroots, it comes with thinking, another one that's planned for all the different sectors without leaving anybody else. And then there's also, a corporate thing that's happening with the market, and which has a lot to do with environmentalism as well. And so this is, what's being imposed on us with this idea of this energy transition that's been really powerful, that doesn't even let us to think about what is we want. And so I say transition in and of itself is a dispute that we need to dispute, and we've got to have this dispute with the North. So we need to talk about it, and we've got to talk about it first of all with the social movements, territorial movements, environmentalist movements, or whatever you want to call them, so that they can include in their debate. I mean, look what's happening here. So look what's happening in the global South in the name of our transitions. So I know that oftentimes this is like a blind spot, right? Oh God, another thing, just let me decarbonize society and we'll see what happens. So we have got to really break in our region that mandate, which is this issue of commodities, to really break with that. I mean, that's not easy. And so the Ecosocial Pact is trying to do that. And it's not, really what we're talking about is, these horizontal ideas that have been really forced over the last couple of decades in the global South. The rights of the nature, good living, retributive justice, just transitions, agroecology, food sovereignty, post-extractivism, autonomy, ecofeminism. So there's so many out there. But what we need to do is to generate, or to try to generate that dialogue. And so what we need to do is really break down, and I'm going to finish with this, which is that idea, that feeling that I have since I've been an environmentalist for 20 years, or social environmentalist, or whatever you want to call it. But and the truth is that, and I talked to Maristela Spampa about this, who was my colleague. We talked about this feeling of deja vu that we're having right now, which is like going back to the beginning. And we could talk about this another time, but with Chile, with this new progressivism, this new second generation, with a new generation of age that come with like new logic, and they can really break with this. But it appears that there's like this big deja vu of like 2008, that again, we're like the bad guys, the one that want to stop progress, and in the name of ecological transition or energy transition.
Thanks very much, Enrique. I want to turn back to you and ask for your thoughts about what's needed to confront these injustices that we've been developing. It's clear that reducing carbon emissions is mandatory to preserve our biophysical living conditions. But if this is only leading to cleaner air and cleaner production in the global north, and it's going to worsen environmental and living conditions on indigenous territory and in affected communities in the global south, as well as in the global north, it would only be this reconfiguration of historical injustices. What are some of the most important paths that you're seeing out of this impasse, in your opinion?
Yeah, I completely agree with Enrique, and I don't want to repeat it. But my point would be, in our deeds here, in the political spheres, of course, we need to understand, to look at these kind of internationalistically. But I would say for Europe at least, but for the global north, we cannot expect from people, from the population, from large parts of the people, that they are internationalists, that they have a kind of a sentiment, an everyday sentiment, a senso comune of global solidarity. I don't get it wrong. Yeah, it's not that I want to be paternalistic, but I think the radical transformation must be a transformation of the everyday life, of the working life, how I live, how I'm in the city, how I commute, what do I eat, etc., etc. But the conditions of it, it's not my choice, it's not my individual, the very conditions, how I live, how can I commute publicly, how I have good food, good ecological food, these conditions are fought out in the society. And when the laws are made, Raj's job and others, the policy making, the large discourses, the investment decisions, these have to be internationalistically. These have to be really, they need to be transformative. This is my point. We cannot expect from the people, from ordinary people, to be transformative. They will be transformative. I'm not paternalistic. I hope I get my argument through. If the living conditions are right, there is a lot of solidarity among people. We know this, yeah. But we cannot expect that now people act in their everyday lives at the global scale, and to have always in mind, oh, the global south, Vaca Muerta, and the large dam protests. But what are the conditions of the everyday life, of the cities, of the food system, etc., etc.? What is it? This, I would say, is the point.
Sorry, Uli, I have a question here, further question. If we cannot expect people, normal, ordinary people, to be solidarian and to have this sensibility for what is going on in the global south, and politicians will only face those realities if it is important for elections, isn't there then a sort of lock-in which makes it totally impossible to get further in this discussion?
No, this is my point. When it's about the living conditions, it's not only about decarbonization. The good living conditions are fought out at a societal level, and people might follow if it's plausible. Yeah, and of course we need a global perspective. But my point is, the global perspective is in very often an objectivation of the South, the poor people of the global South. Yeah, but it's not a political solidarity. And I would say the institutionalization of the political solidarity is then other state policies, other public policies. And it's a very open thinking, because I agree with Esperanza. Of course, the state is also part of the problem. Of course, we cannot expect purely from the state that it should be different, but the fights, I would say, are taking place at other levels. And a sentiment of solidarity, a sentiment of to live differently, yeah, is a precondition, but we should not overload our publics, our people, to say now everything is international solidarity. I don't see it. Yeah, this is a bit my point. To end it with my, and then I will shut up. The danger also when we talk about Green New Deals, that we homogenize strategies. And I like very much what Enrique said. We have so many good concepts. And of course, for our debate, it makes sense to focus on green news. But I would hesitate to talk now globally about Green New Deals as a progressive answer. Yeah? So we have so many other good concepts. Yeah, food sovereignty, solidarity, mobility, etc., etc. So it might push a bit the debate, but we should not think now that with the Green New Deal we have it. And I tell you, in Europe, the concept of the Green New Deal is already bought by the elites. The European Green Deal is an answer to this, and it's very smart. And it's we will see how it develops.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I still am concerned how we are going to achieve these structural changes if at the political level there will only be a reaction if there is some pressure from below, or in the balance of powers. So I would like to shift to you, Rajiv. In the US, what chances are there for what I would call seeds of a sort of new internationalism, a different relation toward the global south? And are there any chances that that translates to a political level which would change the structures of everyday life, as Uli puts it, so that degrowth is not a moral injunction to individuals, but becomes a societal path in some way?
Yeah. I think, yes, there's not only an opportunity, but a necessity to do this because, you know, we are, and it doesn't have to be called, you know, I think that the frame of a global, of a Green New Deal has a certain importance and power in the US context. It doesn't have to be called that in terms of international initiatives or you know, systems of collaboration that we may set up. There have been some global Green New Deal projects and you know, that have convened movements and thinkers and on the left, but whatever it's called, we need it because we are up against capitalism. We're up against global climate change that has resulted from global capitalism. We're dealing fundamentally with global flows of capital and power and exploitation. So I think, you know, if any of us have success at implementing some of this stuff, we're going to be dealing with global obstacles to consolidating those victories and expanding them. And we need to in order to make this work anywhere, we need to all be working together, I think. And, you know, I mean, because, you know, from my perspective in the US, like this is very much a project of the left. And, you know, we have a small group of members of Congress known as the Squad that are closely associated with the Green New Deal. They are in a very somewhat antagonistic relationship with the establishment of the Democratic Party. And, you know, we basically need to be trading lessons with ascendant left governments around the world for the reasons I already said. But like the point I'm trying to make is we are figuring out really for the first time how to try to use the state and transform the state and democratize the state to get at the problem that's come up in a variety of ways here. We need the state to do this. We have to transform it. We have to internationalize the struggle. So we're figuring that out, how to do it, how to work with social movements to bring in a policy that is tied to organizing and that can be transformative. And we don't know what the hell we're doing. We're learning as we go. So like I said, we need to trade lessons. And then the other thing I'll say, and we need to like have each other's back and work in solidarity. And the grassroots based, the left sort of formations that are supporting the Green New Deal are themselves becoming much more internationalist. And just to give a random example, the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, you know, I just saw they're organizing an event where putting in conversation, organizers were trying to unionize Starbucks, the coffee chain here, in putting them in conversation with Starbucks workers who are unionized in Chile. So we just need a lot more of that. And I would propose, I mean, my brain is kind of fixated on legislative products and outcomes because of my job right now. But when it comes to transforming global trade and investment regimes, let's literally collaborate on that. If people like Congressman Bowman, who I work with, are going to be making legislative proposals around how to do that, we should be having relationships where legislative staffers from left formations within these parties are working with staffers and both of us working with movements in our respective countries to put forward. We should be putting forward proposals for bilateral, multilateral, alternative trade, deals, for example. So I'm very excited to follow up from this and do exactly that kind of those kind of initiatives.
Thanks very much, Rajiv. I'm going to try to consolidate. There have been many questions from the audience, and thank you all for the active participation in both the chat and the question and answer. I'm going to share some of the questions. A first group that I'd like to pose to Esperanza and Enrique, if you can, and you choose which and you prefer to expand on. And I'm also going to share right now a few for Rajiv and Uli as well, so you can think a little bit about your responses, and then we'll go in the same order: Esperanza, Enrique, Uli, and Rajiv. First, algunas preguntas para Esperanza y Enrique.
Some questions for Esperanza and Enrique. When we talk about the efforts from the cooperatives, from more grassroots areas, so the Latin American impact, does it have some sort of financial issue when it comes to like the people that are looking to empower themselves through different different initiatives that can be more environmentally friendly? And another question is, what are the actions from the global south that where things aren't imposed but rather are consensual, as Esperanza had mentioned? And another question is, do we need to find examples of economic diversification to make this extractivist agenda more feasible? And so I also have a couple questions for Uli and Rajiv.
Could you coming back to something you commented on earlier in the conversation with regards to the care economy? How are these deals, some of the variety of deals that you're exploring, planning to transform individual, familiar, local care services from externalities into a valued and compensated part of our social or economic system? And perhaps you could expand a bit more too about the viability of degrowth strategies in the industrialized North. And Rajiv, two pieces, if you could comment a bit about water policy and where this might be considered or not in the concepts of the global, the Green New Deals, given that it is a sector that has been highly influenced and funded by corporations and foundations, largely without scrutiny. And what other opportunities for these sorts of progressive connections, north-south, are you seeing, sort of building off of what you've just commented? Entonces, si podemos empezar con Esperanza.
Okay, so we're going to get started with Esperanza. So, some of the proposals of the Ecosocial Pact of the South. Esperanza, go ahead. Well, I think that in the short time that the Pact has been working, we've really been trying to talk about different alternatives. And so I think more than all specific alternatives, we do have some like ideas, some signals about like where we can direct those alternatives. And the first thing is to recognize the ones that exist and to see how we can avoid them being destroyed. And the second thing is to see the ones that can be recovered from like different visions, from like autonomy, and also to see what sort of controls are placed on these that are like that come from the outside. And so the Ecosocial Pact has had a lot of different meetings. We've been trying to work with local governments, with organizations, with existing networks, and in this idea of like how to articulate. And so I think that the dynamic is not to see it as an issue that needs to be seen from the top to the bottom, but rather something that needs to be from the bottom to top, which might sound a little demagogical, but no, because there are processes that are like being anchored in local scenarios in ways to find what you said in your question, like ways that we can have diversification that is not just economic. I think it's just an error to say that everything is just economic diversification, and that it has to do with ways of life, that ways that we take care of life, the way that life is reproduced in all of its different dimensions. And so in all those different dimensions, there are many different variables. And I think the biggest mistake we make is to say that there's this big economic variable, and that's something that we need to resolve for those possible futures. And so in the Ecosocial Pact, when we drew it up, we had included many of these different ideas, which is something that would reinforce food sovereignty. What are the policies of care that need to be maintained? How can we support in these local scenarios, territorial, the different activities, diverse activities that we have from interculturality. And so there's like more possibilities here. There's more ideas when we talk about sustaining relationships, more than like recipes, right? Because, you know, I mean, in such a diverse world, like recipes don't work. Well, we have our principles and values, and really putting as many restrictions as possible on the proposals that come from outside, and protection to the ones that can be inspiring. Thank you so much, Esperanza. Enrique, would you like to add to what Esperanza said? Of course, of course. So first of all, to try to continue answering what was said, there's an issue that's key here that we can't forget in this North-South relationship, and that's related with this, with the different, ways forward, and that is everything that has to do with the relationship with the ecological debt and financial debt. And so I think this is a really important issue. So Latin America has a debt, a financial debt. It's, from doubtful origins. And so, just in interest, not only in Latin America, but in the entire global South, pays $2 billion per year, plus $500 billion per year that go through the earnings of the different countries of origin from the, that are generated from our own income. And so right now we have a really big debt here in Argentina with the IMF, a very large debt that the previous neoliberal government left for us, which is something that we can never pay. But what is generate pressure on our territories? And so we need dollars we need more mining, we need more oil. So we need dollars to be able to pay that debt. So to really sit down, like for real, and start thinking about this debt and really put over on the table the ecological debt and with the financial debt, and really start thinking about, in a mutual way, to see who owes whom, and to start seeing how we can get out of that. And I think that that's really key. And that's something that the Ecosocial Pact talks about, is this ecological debt. And so to really find a very real way, the way that they demand the financial debt from us, to pay that off, to do the same with the other. And then after that, we can't, we're not, a lot of people, we can't really succumb to this temptation and to think that, there's only one destination. Because if we look at ecological collapse, that's something that we're living, we've got, this health collapse. If we just think about like a utopic future, we end up being paralyzed, and we end up working in a way that's really individualistic and selfish. And so it's something that we see very clear in the different, utopic series, and where you see that somebody, goes in their house and they've got like a gun and they try to protect their family. And so those are, utopic futures. So to really think and to look out for a utopic future, that's something that we can't forget about in Latin America, where we always are very, imaginative, and we can really think about a utopic future. And so that makes us confront things with solidarity. And so where here, how can we move forward to have a really just transition? And so I think it's really important that unions, workers are challenges for the socio-environmental movement. And also the country peasants that we have relationships with, but it's really difficult for us to work with large unions. We live in a world where we have a coexistence of so many different ideas and policies and utopias that exist at a local level, but with difficulties to be really translated into a political project at the global level. And that's a big challenge, is to really find, to really get out of this place that we are always stuck in, especially here in Latin America, as an exporter of nature. And that's what I'm going to close with.
I'd like to turn first to Rajiv. If you could share with us your final thoughts and touch on perhaps a bit about water policy and other opportunities for progressive groups in the US in fostering greater dialogue with counterparts in the global South.
Yes, thank you. I have to be, unfortunately, I have to be quick because I have to hop off. My apologies, but it's been an incredible discussion, and I hope the first of many. So I think one of the questions was about care, right? And I'll just say briefly, I mean, we're in an interesting situation, you know, with the US, like, you know, has, obviously we have a particularly vicious form of kind of, you know, neoliberal capitalism, or we've never had certain, we never managed to create certain sort of social public services. We don't have a national healthcare system or a single payer healthcare system like Canada even. So there's a big fight for Medicare for all. We don't have any kind of real public support for childcare. When it comes to home care, for example, for you know, seniors and people with disabilities, this is a sector where we're either, I think, as the person who asked the question pointed out, we're either relying on purely you know, unpaid externalized work that family members and friends are doing for their loved ones, or we have, you know, we have a workforce that's being paid poverty wages, often not unionized. So part of what's interesting is that the Build Back Better bill that I mentioned before, which still hasn't passed, but is the big Biden administration climate, it actually does pair climate investments with some pretty historic, although still fairly moderate investments in these care structures. So paid family and medical leave, which again, we don't have, so that people can take time off to care for children or loved ones who are ill, and keep their jobs, right? We don't have any kind of system. So it would make an investment in that, in expanding access to childcare, home care. There is something, you know, notable about those two things being put together in this big bill, even though the media kind of portrayed it as a grab bag of democratic proposals. It actually, there is sort of a logic. And we tried to, Congressman Bowman, who I work for, tried to articulate a vision of how this fits into the Green New Deal. And I'll just pop it into the chat right now. It's called the Care for All agenda. But part of it is about seeing these sectors as, you know, all of these care sectors, these are green jobs too, you know, nurses and teachers and home care workers, they're all dealing with climate impacts in their jobs. And we have to see these jobs as, you know, good, high paying, we have to make them good, high paying union jobs that really should, they're already a huge part of our economy in the US, and that's only going to keep expanding. So we have to really deal with this crisis. But also, you know, paying unpaid care work. So this resolution that I put in the chat is, normally I wouldn't tell you to read a bill, but this is a resolution. So it's, again, sort of a high level statement of principles. And it tries to lay out a vision there. And so I think we need, you know, also to be moving towards basic income type policies that, you know, we have experimented with a child tax credit that was temporary, but did give everyone, or most families, just a payment for, you know, per child. So I have to run, unfortunately, on water. I apologize. I don't have much to say there, because it really hasn't been, you know, there's a lot of proposals that are relevant, but it hasn't been a central sort of focus among the Green New Deal pieces of legislation yet. But if you, if the person who asked that question wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to chat more. And, you know, there's a standard House of Representatives email, first.lastname@mail.house.gov. So you can probably just Google me and find my email address, but please do reach out. And I'm looking forward to establishing the global Green New Deal, whatever we're going to call it, collaboration out of this. So I really look forward to figuring out the next step on that. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Rajiv. Uli, you get the last word. And if you want to build on some of these thoughts,
you have the last word. two thoughts on care and two thoughts on degrowth. Very good. I agree with Rajiv that care is very much about the care sector, but I would also, if I understood Esperanza right, care is a principle. It's how to look at the world and to overcome this constant quantification, calculation, and to say, no, it's about caring for each other, caring for nature, caring for myself. And this is often devaluated, and this is often contested, and it's part of struggles. And the second is when we talk about care work, yeah, the kind of the jobs, I agree with what Raj said, but the danger is a new round of commodification of care work. We have not non-paid care work, which should be also important and which should be evaluated. And it's not only about putting money into the system and then we solve the care problems. So it's just two very small thoughts. On degrowth, this would be a webinar on its own, of course. Degrowth is not about a shrinking GDP. A shrinking GDP is crisis, and the comrades from Latin America know very well what does it mean. And a shrinking GDP usually is a crisis at the cost of the weaker people, of the population, not of the elites. So what degrowth means in my reading, of course there is a huge debate, is to reduce and to overcome the capitalist imperative of growing. The capitalist imperative that there is a constant growth needed to accumulate capital. And then we talk about property rights, about power relations, about the public versus the private, Esperanza and Enrique were pointing at. Then we start a new thinking, a new debate, and and I would say, and I finish with this, in a lot of well-intended Green New Deal debates of leftist social democracy, this growth imperative is not reflected. It's still there, and of course it's maybe critical with capitalism, but it is not understood. Let's say leftist Keynesians, yeah, of leftist Keynesianism. We need a certain growth, but what I think the strength of the degrowth debate, of the emancipatory radical degrowth debate, is really to impede that capital accumulates permanently in mining, in all the sectors. This is degrowth about.
Thanks, Uli. Yeah, that was a very important point to make at the end. Ahora quisiera agradecerles a todos y todas.
I would really like to thank everyone for having been with us on this debate. Thank you very much for being such an active audience. And I would very much like to thank Heather for interpreting, who has had a key role and a wonderful role. Thank you in this. Thank you, Heather, for making it possible for us to understand each other. And if you think that these are relevant issues, we would like to invite you to distribute the recording of this, which is going to be our Facebook page starting tomorrow, and to create other spaces similar from where you are, to continue with these north-south debate, so that we can see now there's not enough of these different opportunities, but they are very important. And so I will leave you with that invitation to take action and to start really working from wherever you are to do something similar. And so there are many things to talk about: commercial things, trade issues, investment implications, and how we transform all of this. And also for those of us here in the IPS and the Ecosocial Pact of the South, we will be letting you know about the next debates that we will be having about all of these different issues coming in the future. So hugs to everyone, and we hope you have a great night. Thank you very much.
This is Mitch Lapido.